The sound of shattering glass ripped through the night. The crash of tables and chairs thundered through the air, and the roar of a man rose inside the tiny coffee shop on the corner of Dorchester. "Who the hell do you think you are to turn us down?" That December, Boston lay buried beneath the worst blizzard the city had seen in a decade. The wind howled through the alleyways like the wail of a forgotten soul. Outside, the temperature had fallen to -18 degrees, so cold that breath seemed to freeze the instant it left the lips. The snow did not fall gently. It lashed sideways, striking the face like thousands of invisible needles. The Nest coffee shop crouched beneath the fury of the storm. Inside, 3 dark figures had closed in around a young woman. Lennox Ashford, 28 years old, her chestnut hair twisted into a loose, messy bun, her gray-blue eyes sharp and cold, even as she was forced back against the wall. She wore an old sweater worn thin at the shoulder, and her hands were roughened by thousands of hours spent brewing coffee and cleaning the place alone. The leader seized her collar, hauling her off her feet. 3 months. 3 damn months you've been dodging us," he spat. "You think this neighborhood doesn't have rules?" Lennox remained silent. She only looked straight into his eyes, unblinking, unpleading, untouched by fear. That silence landed like a slap across the face of a man used to deciding who lived and who broke. He flew into a rage. He hurled her to the floor. Her head struck the edge of the bar. Her lips split open, and the bitter metallic taste of blood spread across her tongue. The other 2 men kicked over the glass display case, hurled chairs into the wall, and shoved the pastry shelf to the ground. The sound of destruction rang through the shop like a symphony of chaos. In the back room, Piper, 12 years old, held Micah, 8 years old, tightly against her. She covered her little brother's mouth to keep him from crying out. Her eyes were wide with terror as she peered through the crack in the door. Micah trembled in her arms, clutching his sketchbook to his chest like a sacred charm. The leader stood over Lennox, grabbed her by the hair, and yanked her head back. "Next week, you either bring the money out, or this place turns to ash. And those 2 little brats in there." He tilted his head toward the back room, a vicious smile spreading slowly across his mouth. Lennox tried to push herself up, one hand pressed against a floor scattered with broken glass. Blood ran down her chin in slow drops, but still, she did not beg. Not one word, not one plea. Then, in that very instant, the front door burst open. Snow and wind flooded inside like a white wave, and in the heart of the storm, a figure appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered, a long black coat falling almost to his ankles. The stranger stepped into the ruined shop, coming to a halt amidst the wreckage. He remained motionless, a silent sentinel in the heart of the storm, but the moment he entered, the air inside the room changed, as though someone had drawn every last breath of oxygen out of the space. The leader turned around. The savagery on his face gave way to confusion, and then to a pallor like death itself. He released Lennox and stepped back. 1 step, then another. The other 2 men froze where they stood, their eyes fixed on the man who had just walked in. Not a word was spoken. None was needed. The 3 thugs all but fled the shop, vanishing into the white storm as though they had never existed at all. Lennox lay on the floor, splinters of glass embedded in her palm, blood still seeping from the corner of her mouth. She lifted her head and looked toward the stranger. The yellow light fell across his face, revealing a hard, square jaw and piercing gray eyes that mirrored the frozen lake outside. A faint scar ran from the corner of his mouth toward his left ear, the mark of a past she did not want to know. He held out his hand to her, a simple gesture. Wordless. Lennox looked at that hand, then she pushed herself to her feet on her own, brushed the dust from her pants, and wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. She stood straight, facing the man who towered nearly a head above her, and looked directly into his eyes. "Who you are is of no concern to me. I didn't ask for anyone to show up, and I sure as hell don't owe you anything." The man looked at her. Something passed across those cold eyes, too quickly for Lennox to grasp. Then one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the interest of a man who had just stumbled upon something rare. "Jace Sterling," he said, his voice low and slow, like stone rolling along the bottom of a ravine, "and those men were operating on my territory without permission. This has nothing to do with you. Jace Sterling." The name rang through Lennox's mind like a warning bell. All of Boston knew that name. Sterling Empire, the underground empire that controlled half the city, from the harbor to the financial district, and the man at the head of that empire now stood in the middle of her shattered coffee shop. From the back room came the sound of Micah's muffled sobbing. Piper was trying to comfort her little brother, though her own voice trembled as she spoke. Lennox glanced toward the room, then turned back to Jace. She knew she was standing before one of the most dangerous men in America. She knew that with a single nod from him, she and the children could disappear without a trace. But she did not step back. The blizzard howled against the glass outside. 2 frightened children trembled in the back room, and Lennox Ashford stood there facing a Mafia kingpin, blood still on her lip. Yet nothing in her gaze wavered. She did not know that this night had already changed everything, that this man would become the greatest storm of her life, fiercer than any blizzard Boston had ever endured. If you want to know what happens next, please like and share this video to support us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next parts of the story. Jace Sterling did not leave that night. He stood in the middle of the wrecked coffee shop, pulled out his phone, and spoke a few brief words in a low, rough voice. He offered no explanation. He asked for no one's opinion. He simply gave orders. 20 minutes later, while the blizzard was still howling outside the door, a small truck pulled up in front of the shop. 4 men stepped out carrying tools and materials, and they began to work as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Lennox stood beside the ruined bar, watching strangers repair her heating system. She wanted to object. She wanted to throw every one of them out. But Piper and Micah were huddled in the back room, their lips tinged purple from the cold, and outside, the temperature was still dropping. She swallowed her pride the way a person swallows a bitter pill. Jace said nothing more. He lowered himself into the only chair that had survived intact and watched the work crew through eyes that revealed nothing. Now and then, he glanced toward Lennox, as though trying to solve a riddle unlike any he had ever encountered. Close to midnight, the heating system came back to life. Warmth spread slowly through the room, driving away the cold that had cut straight through skin and bone. Piper led Micah out from the back, and both children stared in bewilderment at the unfamiliar man sitting inside their sister's shop. "Go get some sleep," Lennox told them, her voice gentler than usual. "You've got school tomorrow." Piper nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Jace. She took Micah by the hand and led him back into the rear room, pulling the door shut behind them. When the steady sound of the children breathing drifted through from behind the door, Lennox turned back. Jace was still there. "You can leave now," she said. "The heat is working again. Thank you. But I don't need anything else." Jace rose and fastened his coat. He walked toward the door and stopped when his hand touched the knob. "The front window is shattered. The plumbing has problems. The roof is leaking in at least 3 places," he said without turning around. "This shop won't survive the winter." Then he disappeared into the curtain of snow. The next morning, when Lennox woke up, there was no sign left of the man from the night before. No note, no phone number, no message. It was as though he had been nothing more than a strange dream in the middle of a storm. 3 days passed. The nest stood in the grip of a slow death. The broken front window had been covered for the moment with a heavy tarp, but cold wind still pushed in through every gap. The heat had worked for 2 days, then failed again. The water pipes were leaking, leaving patches of ice to form right there on the floor. No customer dared step inside anymore. Lennox counted her savings again. It wasn't enough to repair even a tenth of what needed fixing. She went to the bank wearing the best coat she owned, every document she might need already prepared. She sat waiting for 3 hours in a cold, lifeless hallway, only to be shown into the office of a loan officer whose face looked as hard and expressionless as stone. "Your application doesn't qualify," the woman said, without even bothering to meet her eyes. "I have collateral. I have steady income. Your application doesn't qualify," the woman repeated in a voice as mechanical as a machine. "We can't explain in detail. It's bank policy." Lennox stepped out of the building, and the cold wind struck her face like a second slap. She knew something was wrong. She knew someone had blocked her path, but she had no way to prove it, no power to demand answers. She walked back toward the shop in silence, her steps heavy against the deep snow. When she was still 2 blocks away, she saw the shadow of his vehicle parked right in front. Her heart sank. Jace Sterling was leaning back against the car, his hands in the pockets of his coat, as though he were waiting for something of no particular importance. But Lennox knew there was nothing about this man that could ever be called unimportant. The bank turned you down, he said plainly, with no attempt to soften the words. Are you having me followed? I have people everywhere, he replied, his voice holding not a trace of apology. And I have an offer. Lennox stopped 3 paces away from him and did not move any closer. I don't need your offer. You need money. I have money. That's simple math. Nothing is simple when it involves a man like you. Lennox shot back, her voice cold as sharpened steel. What do you want? Jace pulled a folded sheet of paper from inside his coat and handed it to her. I need a discreet place for private meetings. Twice a month. A coffee shop in Dorchester is the perfect choice, he said. No one would ever expect me to come to a place like this, and that is exactly what I need. Lennox looked down at the paper. It was a layout of the coffee shop, along with a list of everything that needed repair. The detail went all the way down to the last screw. You'll fix all of this? My crew will start tomorrow. I'll cover every expense. Lennox lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes. You could buy this whole building with the loose change in your wallet. Why make a deal? Jace was silent for a moment. Then he tilted his head, and one corner of his mouth curved faintly upward. Because you wouldn't accept it if I just handed you the money. That answer left Lennox still and wordless. Because he was right. Completely right. She turned and looked back at the shop through the tarp covering the broken window. Inside, Piper was trying to tuck another blanket around Micah. Her little brother was curled up on the bench, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. Pride doesn't feed anyone. Pride doesn't keep children warm in the middle of winter. 3 months, she said at last, her voice hard as iron. You fix everything. I let you use the shop 2 evenings a month. After 3 months, we have nothing to do with each other anymore. The deal is over. Jace nodded. One more condition. Lennox stepped forward until she stood directly in front of him, lifting her face so she could look into those dark gray eyes. The children are not to know who you are. They are not to know what you do. To them, you are only a regular customer. Nothing more, nothing less. Agreed. They shook hands. Jace's hand was warmer than she had expected, but the grip was still firm, cold, and entirely without intimacy. A business arrangement. Nothing more, nothing less. He got into the car and closed the door. Before the vehicle pulled away, he lowered the window. My crew will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Then the black car vanished into the crowded flow of a Boston afternoon. True to his word, at 7 o'clock the next morning, a crew of 6 men appeared outside the nest. They worked quickly, professionally, without questions and without curiosity. The window was replaced. The pipes were repaired. The roof was redone. And Jace Sterling began to appear. Not twice a month, the way the agreement had promised, but every few days. Sometimes he came to check on the progress of the work. Sometimes he simply sat in the corner of the shop, drinking a cup of black coffee and watching Lennox work without saying a word. Piper was curious. Micah was cautious. Lennox pretended he didn't exist, but every time he walked in, she noticed. Every time he left, she knew. The presence of Jace Sterling was like an invisible magnet, drawing every eye toward him even when he made no effort at all. No one knew why the head of the Sterling Empire's underground kingdom would care about a tiny coffee shop in the poorest working-class district of the city. Not even he himself. 2 weeks passed like a strange dream Lennox couldn't decide whether to wake from or keep sinking into. The nest was changing its skin day by day. A bright new pane of glass had replaced the torn sheet of tarp. The heating system now ran with a quiet, steady hum instead of its old groan of complaint. The roof had been repaired tight and clean, and the puddles that used to gather whenever the snow melted were gone. The work crew moved with brisk professionalism, arriving early, leaving late, never asking nosy questions. They treated Lennox like air, giving all their attention to the job they had been sent to do. But there was one man who didn't treat her like air. Jace Sterling had started coming by more often than their agreement allowed. Not twice a month, but every 3 or 4 days. Sometimes he stepped in while the crew was still working, stood there watching for a while, then settled into the corner of the shop. Sometimes he arrived when dusk had already begun to gather, ordered a black coffee, and sat there for hours without saying a single word. Lennox pretended not to notice. She wiped down the bar, brewed coffee, checked the books, did whatever she could to keep from looking toward the corner where he sat. But she could feel his eyes following the smallest movement she made. It wasn't the gaze of a man prowling or threatening. It was the gaze of someone trying to understand something he had never encountered before. Piper was the first one to break the silence. One afternoon after school, she sat doing homework at the table near the window, while Jace occupied his usual corner across the room. Piper glanced at the unfamiliar man, then turned toward Lennox, who was standing behind the counter. "Lennox, who is he?" Lennox didn't look up. She kept polishing the cup in her hand. "A customer. A customer who sits here all week. Some people like the coffee here. That's not strange." Piper narrowed her eyes, unconvinced. But she was wise enough not to press any further. Micah was different. The 8-year-old boy had barely spoken since his mother died 6 months earlier. Lennox's aunt had slipped away because of a cruel disease, leaving behind 2 young children adrift in a harsh world. Lennox had taken them in without a word of complaint, even though she knew perfectly well her own life would become 100 times harder. Micah hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried when they packed up his things and moved him in with Lennox. He hadn't cried when he had to change schools, leave his friends behind, and lose every piece of the life he had once known. He had simply gone quiet, curling himself inward around his sketchbook, the way a snail retreats into its shell. On the days Jace appeared, Micah usually sat in the back room drawing pictures no one was allowed to see. He watched the stranger through the narrow crack in the door, his large dark eyes full of curiosity, but he never stepped outside, until that day. Jace was sitting in his usual corner, a cup of black coffee gone cold on the table before him. He was looking out the window, following the slow drift of falling snow. His face held no expression at all, like a statue carved from winter stone. Micah stepped out from the back room, barefoot, his sketchbook clutched tightly in his hands. Lennox saw him and almost called him back, but something made her stop. Maybe it was the way Micah walked, slow and careful, yet without hesitation. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, the first faint spark she had seen there in 6 long months. Micah stopped beside Jace's table. He said nothing. He simply stood there. Jace lifted his head, and his dark gray eyes met the child's clear brown ones. For the briefest instant, Lennox saw something flash across Jace's usually unreadable face. Surprise, confusion, and something deeper than that, something she couldn't quite name. Micah turned the sketchbook toward him and opened it to the newest page. It was a drawing, clumsy strokes of wax crayon, the nest, with 3 people standing inside. A brown-haired woman behind the counter, a little girl doing homework by the window, and a tall man in a black coat sitting in the corner. Jace looked at the drawing. His whole body went still, as though someone had nailed him to the chair. In his world, children looked at him with fear. Adults looked at him with caution or hatred. No one looked at him the way Micah was looking at him now, with eyes so clear and free of judgment, as though he were nothing more than an ordinary man stopping in for a cup of coffee. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, Jace Sterling, the man who could make all of Boston tremble, couldn't find a single word to answer an 8-year-old child. At last he spoke, and his voice was rougher than usual. "You draw beautifully," Micah nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But his eyes brightened for a brief second before he turned and walked back into the rear room. Lennox stood behind the counter and watched all of it. She saw that rare flicker of uncertainty on Jace's face. She saw his hand tremble slightly when he lifted the coffee cup to drink. She saw his eyes follow Micah until the boy disappeared behind the door, and for the first time, she found herself wondering who this man really was beneath that cold and careful mask. That evening, after Piper and Micah had drifted into sleep, Lennox cleaned the shop one last time before closing. She thought Jace had left long ago, but when she turned around, she saw he was still there in the same familiar corner, a 3rd cup of coffee resting on the table in front of him. "We're closed," she said, without looking at him. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Lennox kept arranging the ledgers, numbers dancing before her eyes. Income, expenses, profit. Calculations so deeply rooted in her blood, they came as naturally as breathing. "You're good with numbers," Jace said unexpectedly. Lennox looked up. "How do you know?" "The way you study the books, the way you calculate in your head before you write anything down. Not everyone can do that." Lennox hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice light as a passing breeze. "I used to be a financial analyst. Once." She stopped there, realizing she had already said too much. The past was the one thing she never wanted to talk about. especially with a man like Jace Sterling. But he didn't ask anything more. He didn't push. He only gave the slightest nod, as though that answer was enough for him. Then he rose, pulled on his coat, and walked toward the door. His hand had already reached the knob when he stopped and turned halfway back. "The coffee here is good, the best I've had anywhere." Then he stepped outside, leaving Lennox standing alone in the empty shop, her heart beating one shade faster than before for reasons she couldn't explain. 1 week after the evening Jace praised her coffee, Lennox was standing behind the bar getting ready for a new workday. The children had already gone to school. The shop was empty, as it usually was in the early morning hours. She made herself a shot of espresso, and the dark, bitter scent of coffee spread through the warm air. The bell over the door rang. Lennox looked up, a professional smile already prepared on her lips. But that smile died the instant she saw who had just walked in. Conrad Vance, 55 years old. Silver hair swept back so perfectly not a single strand was out of place. A tailored gray three-piece suit, expensive enough to buy this whole coffee shop outright. Eyes blue and cold as ice. A broad smile on his mouth that never reached his eyes. 3 years earlier, this man had destroyed her life. Lennox felt the blood inside her turn to ice. Her hand tightened around the espresso cup until her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hurl the cup straight into his face. But she did nothing. She only stood there, motionless as a statue. "Lennox Ashford," Vance said, his voice sweet as honey and poisonous as venom. "What a small world this is. From the brightest financial analyst in your class to the owner of a coffee shop in the slums. Life does have a cruel sense of humor." "We don't serve you here," Lennox replied, her voice hard as steel. "The door is behind you." Vance let out a faint laugh. Without being invited, he sat down at the table closest to the bar, crossed one leg over the other, and made himself comfortable as though he owned the place. "I didn't come for coffee," he said. He pulled a file from his leather briefcase and laid it on the table. "I came to talk business." Lennox didn't move. She didn't even look at the file. "This building," Vance said, tapping one finger against the folder cover. "I just bought it from the previous owner. The contract was finalized yesterday. That means starting next month, you'll be paying your rent to me." Lennox felt her heart tighten inside her chest, but her face revealed nothing. "And I've decided to raise the rent," Vance went on, his tone as gentle as if he were commenting on the weather. "Triple the current amount. Of course, if you can't afford it, you're perfectly free to move out." "What do you really want?" Lennox asked bluntly. "Don't waste my time. I'm not interested in your games." Vance tilted his head, the smile on his lips widening, though it only made him look colder. "Direct. I like that." He rose from his chair and walked toward the bar, stopping on the other side of the thin wooden counter that separated them. 3 years ago, when you left First Atlantic, you took something with you, a small flash drive, files that were never supposed to exist. Lennox didn't blink. She didn't breathe any harder. Not a flicker of reaction crossed her face, but inside her mind, the memories of 3 years earlier came rushing back like a flood. She had been 25, top of her class, hired by First Atlantic Bank, with the kind of salary young people dream about. She worked 16 hours a day, rose through the ranks with dizzying speed, and was handed the most important projects. Her future had stretched bright and wide before her. And then, one day, she found the truth. First Atlantic had been laundering money, millions of dollars every month moving through shell accounts, falsified records, and carefully disguised illegal transactions. And Conrad Vance, then the vice president, had been the man running it all. She had been ordered to falsify a set of documents for a high-value client. She refused. The next day, she was fired. Not for refusing to forge records, but for financial fraud. They pinned on her the very crime they themselves were committing. They smeared her name across the entire Boston financial industry. No one would hire her again. No one would believe her again. But before they threw her out, she had managed to copy every piece of evidence onto a flash drive, like a last card hidden up her sleeve, like insurance for the day she might need it. She had never used it. All she had wanted was to leave the past behind and live quietly, but Vance would not let her be. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lennox said, and her voice did not tremble. "Lennox. Lennox." Vance shook his head like a disappointed father scolding a stubborn child. "Don't play this game with me. I've waited 3 years. I can wait longer. But you can't. He looked around the small coffee shop. Such a lovely place. Such sweet little children. It would be a shame if something happened. Lennox stepped out from behind the bar and faced him without the slightest trace of fear. Are you threatening the children? I'm not threatening anyone, Vance said, lifting both hands as though surrendering, though the smile on his mouth remained cruel. I'm simply talking business. About real estate. About rent. About the risks of living in an unsafe neighborhood. He moved toward the door, then stopped for one final parting word. 1 month, Lennox. Think carefully. That flash drive in exchange for peace and quiet for you and the children. A fair trade. The bell over the door rang. Then he was gone. Lennox stood alone in the empty shop. Her hand was still clamped tight around the edge of the bar, her knuckles white with strain and pain. It wasn't fear. She had grown too tired for fear. It was anger. The slow-burning fire that had smoldered inside her for 3 long years suddenly roared to life. They had taken her career, her name, her dreams, and now they wanted to take the last fragile piece of peace she had managed to build. She would not let that happen, no matter what it cost her. Outside the coffee shop, a block away, the obsidian sedan sat motionless at the curb. Jay Sterling was inside, his dark gray eyes following Conrad Vance as he stepped out of the nest. He recognized the man immediately. Vance was one of the Sterling Empire's longtime money-laundering partners, a connection his father had first established 20 years earlier. He watched Vance climb into his car and disappear into the current of the city. Then Jace pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Reed," he said, his voice low and cold. "Conrad Vance. I want everything on him for the last 3 years. Dig into every detail, especially anything connected to a woman named Lennox Ashford." He ended the call and looked back toward the little coffee shop. Lennox's enemies, it seemed, might also be enemies waiting to become his own. But she didn't know that yet. And Jace didn't know that this investigation was about to change everything. 2 weeks after her meeting with Conrad Vance, Lennox's world began to narrow day by day, like a noose drawing tighter around her throat. It started with the unfamiliar cars. A black sedan sat at the corner across from the coffee shop, there every day from morning until night. The man inside never stepped out, never ordered coffee. He only sat there and watched. Lennox knew who had sent him. She didn't need proof. Then came the coffee supplier. One morning they called to say the contract was canceled, with no explanation. She reached out to 3 other suppliers, and every one of them refused to work with her. No one explained. No one needed to. The bakery she had ordered from for 2 years suddenly stopped delivering. The maintenance company for the espresso machine refused to come out for repairs. Even the man who brought fresh milk every day disappeared without a word. Conrad Vance didn't need to dirty his hands himself. All he had to do was give an order, and the whole system would tighten around her like a giant python, slowly crushing until she could barely breathe. Lennox told no one. Not Piper and Micah. Not Jace, who still came by the shop regularly, though she always avoided his eyes now. She carried the burden alone, just as she had for the past 3 years, her shoulders bending a little more each day, though her head remained high. Then that night came, one night in the middle of January, when the temperature outside dropped to -20 degrees. The power grid for all of Dorchester collapsed. This time it wasn't the blizzard. It was simply the old, battered infrastructure of a poor working-class neighborhood finally giving out and surrendering. The nest sank into darkness. Lennox hurried to find candles and lit them everywhere, their golden light trembling on the walls like little ghosts. She turned on the gas heater, pulled Piper and Micah close beside it, and wrapped blankets around their bodies. Micah was shaking, not from the cold, but from his fear of the dark. He clutched his sketchbook tightly to his chest, his eyes wide as he stared at the wavering candle flames. Piper held her brother and tried to look brave, but her voice trembled too when she asked Lennox when the electricity would come back. Lennox didn't know. All she could do was hold both children tighter and try to give them warmth from her own body. Then a knock came at the door, sharp in the stillness of the night. Lennox's heart seized. Her hand reached for the small knife hidden beneath the sofa cushion, the only weapon she had for self-defense. She rose slowly and walked toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who is it? It's me." The familiar low voice came through the wood. Lennox opened the door. Jace stood outside, snow dusting his shoulders, one hand holding a bright industrial flashlight. the other carrying a large paper bag with steam rising from it. "The power's out in the whole neighborhood," he said, as if that were explanation enough for appearing at her door close to midnight. "I know. We're fine. You're shaking." His eyes dropped to her hand, still gripping the edge of the door. "And I brought hot food. For the kids." Lennox wanted to refuse. Wanted to say she didn't need help from anyone. But behind her, Micah peeked out, his eyes lighting up at the smell of food. She stepped aside and let Jace come in. He set the bag on the table. Hot soup, fresh bread, hot chocolate in a thermos. Piper and Micah crowded around at once, their eyes wide as though they had just discovered treasure. Lennox stood beside the bar and watched Jace sit down next to the children, pouring hot chocolate into cups for them. He didn't talk much. He didn't joke around. But there was something in the way he treated Piper and Micah that kept Lennox from looking away. After the children had eaten, Lennox led them to the back room and tucked blankets around each of them. Micah was asleep the moment his head touched the pillow, worn out after a long day. Piper lay still, but her eyes remained open, watching Lennox with a look full of questions. "Go to sleep," Lennox said softly. "You've got school tomorrow." She closed the bedroom door and returned to the front room. Jace was still there, sitting beside the gas heater, candlelight falling across the hard angles of his face. On the table beside him lay a financial report Lennox had forgotten there that afternoon, its pages crowded with figures and charts. She was about to pick it up. Then she noticed something strange. Jace was staring at the report, but he wasn't reading. His eyes moved oddly across the page, skipping from one place to another with no order at all. His brow was drawn tight, his jaw clenched, as if he were trying to decipher a language from another world. Lennox had seen that look before, many times, in students she had tutored in college, in her mother, who had hidden that secret all her life until Lennox discovered it. She understood at once, and that understanding made her go still. "You can't read," she said, her voice light as a whisper of wind. It wasn't a question. Jace froze. His whole body went tight as wire, as if she had pointed a gun at his head instead of speaking one simple sentence. He stood up. Fast. Abrupt. The candle flames shook when he moved toward the door. "I have to go. Jace." He stopped. His back was still turned to her, his shoulders rigid as stone. Lennox stepped closer, stopping a few paces behind him. "My mother couldn't either," she said, her voice carrying no judgment at all. She hid it her whole life. She felt ashamed every time she had to sign her name, terrified whenever someone handed her papers and asked her to read. "I found out when I was 15. She paused and drew in a deep breath. "I taught her how to read." Before she left, silence stretched between them. Candlelight flickered against the walls, throwing shadows that danced like ghosts. Jace still didn't turn around. But he didn't leave either. "This is a secret," he said at last, his voice hoarse, as if each word had to be dragged from his throat by force. "If anyone finds out." "I'm not just anyone," Lennox cut in, "and I have no intention of telling anyone." She walked back to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. "Sit down," she said, her tone as calm as if she were inviting him to have coffee. "I'll teach you." Jace turned then, and for the first time, Lennox saw something different in those dark gray eyes that were usually so cold and controlled. Not anger, not threat, fear, the kind of fear he had hidden all his life, buried beneath the mask of power and ruthlessness. He looked at her, looked at the empty chair, looked at the financial report with its swarming letters and numbers he had never been able to understand. Then Jace Sterling, the most powerful mafia boss in Boston, the man who could make an entire city tremble with a single look, slowly walked back to the table and sat down. It was the first night he let another person see who he really was, and she didn't run. No one ever gave those evenings a name. No one ever admitted they existed, but they became a habit, as natural as breathing, as steady as the beating of a heart. Each night, after Piper and Micah had drifted off to sleep, the small kitchen behind the coffee shop turned into a secret classroom. Soft yellow light spilled across the old wooden table, where Jace Sterling sat across from Lennox. A first-grade textbook opened between them. On the first night, Jace could barely manage to read a single complete word. The letters danced before his eyes, spinning, twisting, refusing to stay still. He stared at the page with eyes full of frustration, his jaw clenched so tightly it had to ache. Lennox didn't rush him. She didn't grow impatient. She didn't sigh, or let even a hint of pity show on her face. She simply sat there, patient as a river wearing its way through stone, waiting for him one step at a time. One sound at a time, she said, her voice gentle but steady. Don't try to read the whole word. Just look at each letter, then put them together. Jace did as she said, slowly, haltingly, like a child learning his very first steps. C-A-T, he sounded out, his brow furrowed with concentration. Cat. A cat. That's right, Lennox said with a nod. And in that moment, Lennox saw something she had never seen before on the face of Jace Sterling. A glimmer lit his eyes, small but bright, like the first shaft of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It was pure joy, raw and unguarded, the kind of feeling he perhaps hadn't known since he himself had been a child. The evenings that followed unfolded much the same way. Jace came after dark. They sat in the little kitchen, wrapped in the glow of warm yellow light. Lennox taught. Jace learned. No one spoke of the world outside, of Sterling Empire, of Conrad Vance, of anything at all, except the words on the page before them. In that kitchen, Jace wasn't a Mafia boss. He was only a man trying to learn what he should have been taught 30 years earlier. During the day, things began to change as well. Jace no longer came only at night. He started appearing earlier, sometimes just after the children got home from school. He still sat in his familiar corner, but he no longer stayed there in silence, watching from a distance. One afternoon, Piper was wrestling with an algebra problem, her face twisted as though someone were forcing her to swallow a lemon whole. Lennox was busy making coffee for customers and couldn't help her right away. Jace rose from his corner and walked over to Piper's table. She looked up, her wide eyes fixed on the strange man with the scar on his face. "Let me see," he said, his voice no softer than usual, but not threatening either. Piper hesitated for a second, then turned her notebook toward him. Jace looked down at the numbers. Numbers, the one thing he was good at, the one thing that never danced or spun in front of him the way letters did. He picked up a pen, wrote out each step of the solution, and explained it to Piper in a voice that was brief and clear. Piper followed along, her eyes growing brighter as understanding dawned. "Oh, so that's how you do it," she exclaimed. "That's easy. Why doesn't my teacher explain it like that?" Lennox stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold. She saw Jace, the Mafia boss feared by the entire city, bent over explaining a math problem to a 12-year-old girl with a patience she would never have guessed he possessed. Micah began to change too. He no longer hid in the back room every time Jace appeared. Instead, he sat quietly in the corner drawing, and now and then he would glance at the strange man with open curiosity. Once, Jace caught Micah looking at him. He said nothing, only gave the boy a small nod. Micah nodded back, then returned to his drawing. It was a silent exchange, but Lennox knew it meant more than 1,000 spoken words ever could. Then that night came. 2 weeks after their first lesson, Jace sat in the small kitchen with the book open in front of him. A short passage, about 5 sentences long, written for a child in the 3rd grade. He began to read, slowly, carefully, one word at a time. The boy walked to the store. He didn't stumble. He didn't stop. He didn't mix anything up. He kept going. The 2nd sentence. The 3rd. The entire passage. When he finished, silence settled over the kitchen. Jace lifted his head and looked at Lennox, and his eyes were no longer cold. In them was a question he didn't know how to ask aloud. "Did I do it?" Lennox smiled. It wasn't the polite smile she gave customers. It wasn't the strained smile she used to hide her exhaustion. It was real, shining out of her gray-blue eyes and softening her whole face in the yellow light. "You did it," she said, her voice warm. Jace looked at her, looked at that smile. The yellow light rested against her face, casting soft shadows across her skin. Her hair had fallen loose over her shoulders, a few strands slipping free from the knot and drifting across her forehead. She wasn't perfect. She was tired from a long day of work, but in that moment, with that smile, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He realized he had been staring too long. "Your smile is beautiful," he said, and the words slipped out before he could stop them. Silence. Lennox went still. The smile on her lips slowly faded, replaced by an expression she couldn't hide. Surprise, confusion, and something else she didn't dare name. Jace stood up abruptly. The chair scraped sharply against the floor. "I have to go," he said, his voice turning stiff again. "It's late." He walked out of the kitchen, grabbed his coat, and didn't look back. The front door slammed shut behind him faster than usual. Lennox sat alone in the empty kitchen, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Her hand rose to her chest without thinking, as though she might somehow press that wild rhythm back down. This is only an arrangement, she told herself. He's only a customer. Nothing more, nothing less. But her heart refused to listen. Outside, Jace sat in the familiar black car. He didn't start the engine. He didn't drive away. He only sat there, both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes lifted toward the kitchen window where the yellow light was still glowing. All his life, Jace Sterling had never let anyone come close. He had never let anyone see the fragile places inside him. He had never allowed himself to want anything beyond power and control. But tonight, sitting in the cold dark and looking up at that warm square of light, he found himself wondering, could life have been different? Could he have been someone else? Someone worthy of that smile? He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in 33 years, he allowed himself to ask the question. A week had passed since the night Jace hurried away after telling Lennox her smile was beautiful. He still came every evening to learn to read, but there was an invisible distance between them now, delicate as a strand of silk, and yet both of them could feel it. Lennox knew she couldn't keep going like this. She couldn't keep letting Jace step deeper into her life while she still held secrets that could destroy everything. He had shown her his weakness. Maybe it was time for her to do the same. That night, after Piper and Micah had fallen fast asleep, Lennox sat across from Jace in the small, familiar kitchen. But instead of opening the book as she always did, she rose and walked to the refrigerator. Jace watched her with cautious eyes. He could tell something was different in the way she moved, in the tension resting across her shoulders. Lennox pulled the refrigerator out a little, reached into the gap behind it, and drew out a small black flash drive. She set it on the table between them like a bomb waiting for its time. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice calm even though both hands were clenched tightly beneath the table. "About Conrad Vance. About why he's hunting me." Jace looked at the flash drive, then lifted his eyes to Lennox. He said nothing. He only waited. Lennox drew in a deep breath. 3 years ago, I worked at First Atlantic Bank, financial analyst. I was good at what I did, good enough that they trusted me with their most sensitive projects. She paused for a moment, and that's when I found out they were laundering money. Millions of dollars every month moving through shell accounts, front companies, and falsified records. Jace remained silent, but his eyes darkened. They wanted me to forge a set of documents. I refused. Lennox gave a bitter little laugh. The next day, I was fired for financial fraud. They accused me of the exact crime they were committing themselves. They destroyed my name. No one in the industry would hire me again. She pointed to the flash drive. But before they fired me, I copied everything. Proof of every illegal transaction. That's why Vance is after me. He knows I have it, and he won't stop until he gets it back. Silence stretched between them. Candlelight trembled across the walls. Lennox looked at Jace, waiting for his reaction. But what she received wasn't what she had expected. Jace stared at the flash drive. Then he closed his eyes. His face turned to stone. "The organization First Atlantic was laundering money for," he said slowly, each word sounding as though it had to be dragged out of him by force. "Do you know who that organization was?" Lennox shook her head. "No. I only saw where the money was flowing through. I never knew the final destination." Jace opened his eyes and looked straight at her. And in those dark gray eyes, Lennox saw something that made the blood in her veins turn cold. Guilt. "That organization was Sterling Empire," he said, his voice stripped of feeling. "My father established the connection with First Atlantic more than 20 years ago, and Conrad Vance has been one of the most important partners of this empire ever since." Lennox's world collapsed. Not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once. Completely, like a building wired with explosives, falling in a single instant. The man sitting in front of her, the man she had taught to read, the man she had begun to trust, begun to open herself to, begun to feel things for that she didn't dare name. He was part of the very system that had destroyed her life. Lennox stood so fast her chair crashed backward with a harsh, jarring sound. "Get out," she said, and her voice was so cold even she barely recognized it. Sharp as a razor's edge. "Get out of my shop, right now." Jace stood too. "Lennox, listen to me. Let me explain. I didn't know about what happened to you. Vance acted on his own. I had no "Know what?" she cut in, her voice rising. "No idea your empire was built on dirty money. No idea every dollar moving through those accounts carried someone's blood and tears on it." "Mine." Jace didn't answer. He couldn't, because she was right. He knew Sterling Empire wasn't clean. He had always known. He just had never looked directly at what that meant, never seen a real face, a real story, a real victim, until now. "I'll deal with Vance," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll end that relationship. You'll what?" Lennox stepped closer, her gray-blue eyes blazing like twin flames. "Give me back the 3 years that were stolen from me. Give me back my career. Give me back my faith in people." Silence. Jace wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat and refused to come, because there was nothing he could say that would change the past. Nothing he could do that would erase what had been done to her. He walked toward the door, paused for one brief moment, his back still turned to Lennox. Then he stepped outside without looking back. The door shut behind him. Lennox stood alone in the kitchen, the flash drive still lying on the table, the candlelight still flickering on the walls. She didn't cry. She was too tired for tears. There was only the slow-burning fire of anger inside her chest, devouring everything she had thought she was beginning to build. Outside, Jace sat in the shadow of his vehicle. He didn't start the engine. He didn't drive away. He only sat there in the dark, both hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Reed Holloway answered on the first ring. "Boss, prepare every file on every transaction between Conrad Vance and Sterling Empire," Jace said, his voice cold as ice. "Everything from the past 20 years, and prepare a plan to sever that relationship completely." Silence filled the other end of the line. Reed understood exactly what that order meant. Vance was one of their oldest partners, one of the most important. Cutting him loose wouldn't be simple. "I understand," Reed said at last. "It'll be on your desk by morning." Jace ended the call and looked up at the kitchen window where the light had just gone dark. He couldn't repair the past. He couldn't change what his father had built. He couldn't erase the sins his empire had carried into the world, but he could choose the future. And that future would begin by burning the venomous snake named Conrad Vance to the ground. 3 days passed since the night Lennox threw Jace out of the shop. 3 days he didn't appear. No phone call, no message, as though he had never existed in her life at all. Lennox told herself this was what she wanted. She had sent him away. She had chosen to sever every tie with a man who belonged to the same world that had destroyed her. This was the right decision. Then why did the little kitchen feel so empty every night? And then strange things began to happen. On the morning of the second day, the black sedan that had been parked at the corner across from the shop for weeks suddenly disappeared. Lennox looked out the window, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. No one was watching her anymore. That afternoon, the coffee supplier called. The man on the other end sounded flustered and apologetic, saying there had been a misunderstanding, that they would be very happy to continue working with her, that her order would be delivered the next morning. Lennox hadn't even had time to ask why before the call ended. On the third day, a letter arrived from the building management company. Her lease had been renewed at the old rate. No increase, no condescend. The signature of the new owner sat at the bottom of the page, but the name had been hidden beneath a company seal. Someone was intervening. Someone was cutting away each strand of the noose. Conrad Vance had tightened around her throat. Lennox knew who it was. She didn't need proof. But she didn't know how she was supposed to feel about it. That weekend, the Winter Charity Gala was held at the Langham Hotel, the biggest annual event in Boston's upper crust. $1 million suits, diamond-stitched gowns, glasses of champagne that cost more than a month's rent in all of Dorchester. This was the playground of the rich and powerful, the place where they donated money to poor children by daylight and signed dirty deals by night. Conrad Vance was one of the principal sponsors. He stood in the middle of the ballroom like a king, surrounded by older businessmen, laughing and talking as though he didn't have a single worry in the world. Jace Sterling was the guest of honor. He entered the ballroom at 9 o'clock that night, alone, with no one on his arm. Crystal chandeliers poured light over his perfectly tailored black suit, sharpening the lines of his tall frame and broad shoulders. The scar on his face looked like a quiet warning amid the crowd of polished and pampered faces. His arrival moved through the room like a cold wave. Every conversation paused for a beat. Every eye turned toward him. In this world, Jace Sterling wasn't merely a guest. He was the kind of man who could buy the entire hotel on a whim if he chose to. Vance spotted Jace from across the room. The smile on his mouth stiffened for the briefest second, then returned. He raised his champagne glass in greeting from a distance. Jace didn't answer. He walked to the bar, took a glass of whiskey, and stood alone in the corner of the room, watching. 1 hour passed, then 2. Social chatter, hollow handshakes, smiles that never reached the eyes. Jace endured it all, wearing the same cold expression he always did. Then Vance made his move. He stepped into the center of the room and lifted his glass as though about to make a speech. The crowd gradually fell silent and turned toward him. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Vance began, his voice sweet as honey. "And I especially want to thank Jace Sterling, our longtime friend and partner." Jace didn't react. He only looked at Vance with eyes stripped of all emotion. "Jace has always been a busy man," Vance went on, his smile widening. "But lately, I hear he's found himself a new interest. A little coffee shop in Dorchester." He paused, letting the scattered laughter ripple through the room. "And the owner, from what I hear, knows very well how to make coffee, and how to catch the attention of powerful men." The whispering began at once, curious glances, mocking smiles. Vance was smearing Lennox in front of the entire Boston elite, turning her into a woman who climbed by beauty, into someone ambitious enough to do anything to escape the slums. Jace set his whiskey down. Then he walked toward Vance. Slowly, one step at a time, the crowd parted on its own, making way for him like the Red Sea opening before Moses. Vance was still smiling, but the smile began to tremble when Jace stopped directly in front of him, only an arm's length away. Silence swallowed the ballroom. No one dared breathe too loudly. "Conrad," Jace said, his voice low and deliberate, each word falling like stone. "If you mention her one more time, I'll remind you why 20 years ago my father had you on your knees begging in the middle of a boardroom." The color drained from Vance's face. He remembered that day. No one else in that room remembered it, but he did. And Jace knew he did. Jace turned toward the crowd, his voice carrying through the stillness of the ballroom, and an announcement for all of you. "As of tonight, every business relationship between Sterling Empire and Conrad Vance is officially terminated. Every related account will be frozen tomorrow morning." He looked back at Vance, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smile cold enough to wound. "You're welcome to find yourself new partners, assuming anyone is still willing to do business with you after tonight." Then he turned and walked away. No haste, no backward glance. He left Conrad Vance standing like a statue in the middle of the ballroom, his face white as paper, his hand trembling around the stem of his champagne glass. The crowd began whispering again, but this time, they weren't whispering about the owner of a coffee shop. They were whispering about Conrad Vance, the man Jace Sterling had just humiliated in front of the whole upper crust of Boston. The next morning, the news reached Lennox through Meredith Shaw, her 60-year-old neighbor whose granddaughter worked as a server at the Langham Hotel. Meredith told the whole story with bright, shining eyes, from the way Jace walked straight up to Vance, to the words he spoke, to the way the entire ballroom had frozen in stunned silence. Lennox sat behind the counter, a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, her heart beating so hard she could hear the sound of it in her ears. Jace Sterling had defended her publicly, in front of the whole Boston elite, in front of her enemy, in front of the world. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Anger because he had interfered in her life without asking. Gratitude because he had done what she could never have done alone. Or something else entirely, something warm and dangerous spreading through her chest. She knew only one thing. Her heart was beating faster, and the little kitchen behind the shop had never felt emptier. Conrad Vance was not the kind of man who accepted humiliation without striking back. 2 days after the gala, while the news of his disgrace was still being passed from mouth to mouth through all of Boston's upper crust, Vance chose to retaliate, not by attacking Jace Sterling directly, because he wasn't powerful enough for that, but by striking at the one weakness he knew Jace was trying to protect. Lennox was closing the shop on Tuesday evening when her phone began to vibrate. A message from an unknown number. No name. She opened it and read, "The flash drive, 48 hours, or we'll come collect the children." The phone nearly slipped from Lennox's hand. She had to brace herself against the bar to stay upright, her knees suddenly weak as though someone had drained every ounce of strength from her body. The children, they were threatening Piper and Micah. She looked toward the back room, where the two little ones were sleeping soundly after a long day at school. Piper, 12 years old, still dreaming of becoming a doctor. Micah, 8 years old, only just beginning to open his heart again after his mother's death. They were everything Lennox had in this world, and now they were being threatened. That night, Lennox didn't sleep. She sat on the sofa beside the front door, the small kitchen knife in her hand, her eyes fixed on the entrance. Every sound outside, even nothing more than wind brushing through tree branches or the passing hum of a car, made her heart lurch. The next morning, just after first light, she looked out the window and felt the blood in her veins turn cold. A black car was parked directly in front of the shop. Not Jace's car. A different one, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see through them. It stayed there for hours. No one got out. No one came into the shop. It just sat there, like a reminder, we know where you are. We can come whenever we want. On the second night, Lennox still didn't sleep. She brought Piper and Micah into her own room, locked the door, and dragged a dresser in front of it. Then she sat awake all night long, the knife in her hand, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She had fought alone for 3 years. She had pulled herself back up every single time she fell. She had refused every offer of help out of pride, out of a refusal to owe anyone anything, out of the stubborn belief that she was strong enough to survive on her own. But this was no longer about her. This was about Piper and Micah. On the morning of the third day, when the black car was still parked in the same place, Lennox pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to try 3 times before she punched in the correct number. The line rang twice. "Lennox?" Jace's voice came through from the other end, not surprised, as though he had been waiting for this call. "I need you here," she said, her voice rough from 2 sleepless nights. Right now. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what had happened. He only said 2 words. 15 minutes. Exactly 15 minutes later, Jace's familiar black car pulled up in front of the shop. He stepped out and looked at the strange car parked across the street, with eyes cold as winter steel. Whoever was sitting inside that vehicle must have recognized him, because only seconds later the engine started and the car vanished. Jace walked into the shop. Lennox was standing behind the bar, her face pale, dark hollows beneath her eyes, her hands still trembling a little. He said nothing. He only stepped closer and stood across from her, waiting. Lennox handed him her phone, the threat still glowing on the screen. Jace read it. His face didn't change. Not one muscle moved. But Lennox saw something shifting in those dark gray eyes. It wasn't ordinary anger. It was a slow, dangerous fire, the kind she had never seen in him before. "The children," he said, his voice so low it was almost a growl. He dared to threaten the children. "That car has been parked out there for 2 days, Lennox said, exhaustion weighing down every word. "They haven't done anything. They just sit there. So I know they can come whenever they want." Jace pulled out his phone and dialed. The call connected at once. "Read. Send 2 teams to the nest in Dorchester. Right now. Guard it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No one gets within 100 meters without my permission." He paused. "And find out who was driving the car that just pulled away. I want a name, an address, and whoever's paying them." He ended the call and looked back at Lennox. "From now on, you and the children will have protection. They won't interfere with your life. You probably won't even see them. But they'll be there." Lennox opened her mouth to protest. "I don't need." "This isn't about what you need or don't need," Jace cut in. He stepped forward and placed both hands on her shoulders. His hands were warm and steady, like an anchor keeping her from being swept away in the storm. "This isn't about pride. It's about Piper and Micah, about keeping them safe." Lennox looked up and met his eyes. The usual coldness wasn't there. The mask of the Mafia boss wasn't there either. There was only real concern, deep and unguarded, for 2 children who had almost no connection to him at all. "Let me protect them," he said, his voice softer now. "Just that. You can keep hating me afterward." Lennox closed her eyes. She wanted to refuse, wanted to say she was strong enough, but the image of Piper and Micah asleep in the back room rose before her. They trusted her. They depended on her. She had no right to let pride place them in danger. "All right," she said at last, her voice no more than a whisper. "Only for the children." Jace nodded. He took his hands from her shoulders and stepped back. "I'll deal with Vance," he said. "This time, he won't have another chance to threaten anyone." Then he left, leaving Lennox alone in the shop. But this time, it was different. This time, when the door closed behind Jace, Lennox didn't feel alone. She felt safe. For the first time after days without sleep, after nights spent shaking with a knife in her hand while guarding the door, she felt that someone was standing on her side, and that frightened her more than any threat ever could, because it meant she was beginning to depend on him, beginning to trust him, beginning to need him. And Lennox Ashford had learned long ago that needing someone was the first step toward being hurt. A week passed in a strained kind of peace, like the surface of a lake before a storm. Conrad Vance went silent. No threatening messages. No cars following her. No movement of any kind. Jace's security team reported that everything was normal, with no sign of suspicious activity from Vance's side. Maybe he was waiting. Maybe he was calculating his next move. Or maybe he had finally realized he no longer had the strength to stand against Sterling Empire. But Conrad Vance wasn't what troubled Jace most. It was himself. Every evening, he came to the nest as if pulled there by a habit he couldn't resist. There was no longer any excuse of a business arrangement. No longer any reason to inspect an investment. He came because he wanted to. And that truth frightened him more than any enemy ever had. He sat in his usual corner, watching Piper laugh with Lennox about school and homework. The 12-year-old girl had started calling him Mr. Jace instead of that man, and every time he heard it, something warm spread quietly through his chest. Micah no longer disappeared into the back room whenever he arrived. The boy began sitting closer, sometimes even showing him his newest drawings. Once, Micah drew 4 people standing in front of the coffee shop, and when Jace asked who they were, the boy only looked at him with clear, innocent eyes, as if the answer were already obvious. And Lennox, she no longer looked at him with the same guarded eyes as before, no longer so stiff, no longer so distant. Sometimes, when they sat together in the little kitchen at night, she would smile at one of his awkward jokes. Sometimes their hands brushed when she passed him a book, and neither of them hurried to pull away. Jace was holding something he had never had in all 33 years of his life, something that felt dangerously close to family, and that terrified him all the way down to the bone. Because Jace Sterling wasn't allowed to have a family. He was the head of an underground empire, a man with hundreds of enemies waiting for the smallest chance to strike. Anyone who came close to him became a target. Vance had already proved that when he threatened Piper and Micah. If Jace stayed, someone else would see his weakness. Someone else would come for Lennox and the children in order to hurt him. And next time, it might not stop at threats. That night, Jace sat alone in his office at Sterling Tower, staring out over Boston through the wall of glass. The city lights flickered below like fallen stars, cold and far away. Reed Holloway stood near the door, waiting. "If I leave," Jace said slowly without turning around, "she won't matter as a target anymore. The children won't either. No one will touch them if they no longer have anything to do with me." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped forward and placed a file on the desk. "I already prepared everything. Proof of every illegal act Conrad Vance committed will be sent anonymously to the FBI tomorrow morning. He'll be investigated, and his assets will be frozen. He'll be too busy trying to save himself to think about anyone else." Jace nodded. "And that coffee shop building," Reed continued. "I bought it from Vance 2 weeks ago. The transfer papers putting ownership in Lennox Ashford's name are ready." Jace turned to look at his right-hand man. Reed was the only person who knew about his dyslexia, the only person who had stood beside him through the past 10 years. And Reed knew this decision was killing something inside his boss. "Are you sure?" Reed asked quietly. Jace didn't answer. He only turned his eyes back to the window, where Boston's lights flickered through the cold night. The next morning, Jace came to the nest for the last time. The children had already gone to school. The shop was empty. Lennox stood behind the bar, drying spotless cups. When she heard the bell above the door, she looked up, and a small smile passed across her lips when she saw him. That smile cut through Jace's chest like a blade. He walked to the bar without sitting down the way he always did. Instead, he placed a thick envelope on the counter. Lennox looked at the envelope, then up at him, her eyes full of questions. "What is this?" "The transfer papers for ownership of this building," Jace said, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. "From now on, you own it. No one can force you out or raise your rent again." Lennox went still. "You can't. I can. And I did," Jace cut in. "There's one more thing inside." She opened the envelope. Inside, along with the heavy stack of legal documents, was a small folded note. Lennox unfolded it. The handwriting was clumsy, the lines shaky, like the writing of a child still learning, but every letter was clear, careful, as though the person who wrote it had poured every ounce of himself into each stroke. You taught me to read. You taught me to see things I thought I'd never be able to see. I have nothing worthier to give in return. Thank you. Jay Lennox lifted her head, her eyes beginning to burn. Jace, what's happening? Goodbye, Lennox. Those two words fell between them like cold stones. Jace turned and walked toward the door. He didn't slow down. He didn't look back. Jace. Lennox ran out from behind the bar and chased after him. Stop. You can't just... But he had already opened the door. Already stepped outside. Already disappeared into the darkness of his vehicle waiting for him. The door shut. The sound of the engine rose, then silence. Lennox stood alone in the empty shop, the envelope still in her hand, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She didn't understand. She didn't understand why he would do this, why he would give her everything and then walk away, why he would write those words and disappear as though she had only been one chapter in the book of his life, one chapter that had now ended. She looked down at the note in her hand, at the clumsy, uneven letters, full of effort and care, the handwriting of a 33-year-old man learning to read for the first time in his life, the handwriting of the man who had just walked out of hers, and Lennox realized, with a pain that tore straight through her, that she had let him go far too deep into her heart without ever knowing it. 3 days had passed since Jace walked out of the nest and never came back. Lennox tried to live as though nothing had changed. Every morning, she woke at 5 o'clock, made coffee, and prepared breakfast for the children. Every afternoon, she picked Piper and Micah up from school, listened to their stories about class, and helped them with their homework. Every evening, she closed the shop, cleaned up, and checked the books. But everything felt hollow. The little kitchen behind the shop was now only an ordinary room, no longer the secret classroom where she had taught a Mafia boss to sound out letters one by one. The chair in the corner where Jace used to sit remained empty, and every time her eyes drifted that way, something in her chest tightened. She told herself this was what she wanted. He belonged to the world that had ruined her. He was part of that system. Him leaving was best for everyone. Then why did her chest ache so badly every night? Piper could tell something was wrong. At 12 years old, she was far too perceptive not to notice the dark circles growing heavier beneath Lennox's eyes, not to see the smile on her sister's face becoming more strained by the day. But she didn't ask. She simply helped more. She made dinner for Lennox. She read stories to Micah before bed. Micah changed too. He drew less. Sometimes he sat by the window for hours, as though waiting for someone to appear. On the third night, everything fell apart. Lennox was lying in bed, her eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling, when she heard the strange sound of water running in the kitchen. She sat up and listened. The sound grew louder, not the ordinary trickle of a faucet, but a rushing torrent like a waterfall crashing down. She ran downstairs and hit the light switch. Nothing. No electricity. The building's old wiring had failed again. In the darkness, lit only by moonlight slipping through the window, Lennox saw water spraying from the pipe beneath the sink. The old pipe had split wide open, and freezing water was pouring across the kitchen floor, rising around her ankles. She waded in, opened the cabinet beneath the sink, and searched for the shutoff valve. Her hands moved blindly in the dark until they found the old wrench. She tried to turn the rusted valve, but it wouldn't move. The water was so cold it bit into her skin. The floor was slick beneath her feet. Lennox braced herself and threw all her strength into the wrench. Her foot slipped. She fell backward, her spine slamming into the edge of the cabinet, her head striking the wet tile floor. Pain, cold, water. The pipe kept gushing, flooding around her like an icy embrace. Lennox lay there. She didn't try to get up. She didn't try to fight. She simply lay there on the flooded kitchen floor, in the cold dark, and let everything she had held back for 3 long years finally break free. The tears came first in silence, then with sobs she couldn't contain. Not because of the burst pipe, not because the floor was flooding, but because of everything. 3 years of trying to survive alone. 3 years of building walls around her heart and refusing every offer of help, refusing every kind of closeness. She had told herself she was strong enough, told herself she didn't need anyone, told herself loneliness was the price of safety. Then Jace had come into her life with those dark gray eyes and the secret he had hidden all his life. He had broken down every wall she had built, one brick at a time, until she had stood bare before him with all her wounds and all her fears exposed, and she had let him go. No. He had chosen to go. He had decided she would be better off without him. He had decided for her, just the way her mother had decided to leave when Lennox was still a little girl. Why did everyone she cared about always leave? Small footsteps sounded on the stairs. Lennox tried to stop crying, tried to sit up, but her body had no strength left. She could only lie there, soaked through, eyes swollen and red, her tears mixing with the water from the broken pipe. Piper appeared in the kitchen doorway, Micah just behind her. Moonlight fell across their faces, showing eyes gone wide with fear. They saw Lennox, their Lennox, the one who was always strong, always steady, always the safe place to fall. And now she was lying on the flooded kitchen floor, crying like a child who had been abandoned. Piper didn't scream. She didn't panic. She stepped into the kitchen without caring about the freezing water soaking her feet and knelt beside Lennox. "Get up," she said softly, but with certainty. "You're freezing." Micah ran to get a blanket. He came back and wrapped it around Lennox's shoulders, while Piper helped her to her feet. The children led Lennox out of the kitchen and into the living room, settling her onto the sofa. Piper went for more blankets. Micah stayed close beside her, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. No one said anything. No one questioned her. They were simply there beside her. Lennox looked at the two children she had sworn to protect. Children who had lost their mother, who had already endured too much for lives so young. Children who should never have had to be this strong. And yet here they were, comforting her instead of the other way around. "I'm sorry," Lennox whispered, her voice raw and hoarse. "I should have been stronger." Piper shook her head. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she said, her voice older than her years. "Mr. Jace told me that. He said you're the bravest person he's ever met, but even the bravest person is allowed to get tired." Lennox looked at her, and fresh tears filled her eyes. "He said that?" Before he left, Piper nodded. "He said sometimes people leave not because they don't care, but because they care too much and they're afraid they'll cause pain." Micah pressed himself against Lennox, his head resting on her shoulder. He said nothing. He was simply there, warm and quiet. Lennox held both children tightly and let the tears fall without stopping them. She didn't know whether she could bring Jace back. She didn't know whether he would even want to come back. She didn't know whether it was already too late. But she knew one thing. She was tired of letting fear make her choices for her. Tired of pushing people away. Tired of being alone. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to stop running. The next morning, weak winter sunlight slipped through the windows of the coffee shop and fell across Lennox's face, still swollen from crying through the night. She sat at the table, a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands, her eyes fixed on nothing at all. Last night, after the children helped her into the living room, she had fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. Now, in the clear light of day, everything still felt hazy, like the remains of a strange dream. Piper and Micah sat across from her, watching with the kind of worry children should never have to carry. The breakfast dishes still sat untouched on the table. No one had eaten much. Lennox was about to say something, to tell the children she was fine, that everything would be all right. But Piper spoke first. "Lennox," she said, placing her hand on the table, her small fingers curled tightly around something. "I have something for you." Lennox looked down. Piper opened her hand, revealing a piece of paper folded into fourths, wrinkled as though it had been kept in a pocket for days. "Mr. Jace gave it to me before he left," Piper said softly. "He told me to give it to you only if you really needed it, I think." She hesitated. "I think now is when you need it." Lennox looked at the paper. Her heart suddenly began to beat faster, as though it already knew that whatever was inside might change everything. She took it and slowly unfolded it. The clumsy handwriting appeared before her eyes, shaky, awkward lines, like the writing of a child still learning how to form words. But every letter was clear, careful, as though the person who wrote them had poured every part of himself into each stroke. "Lennox, I'm not good with words, but there are things I need you to know. I left because I was afraid. Afraid I would hurt you. Afraid my world would swallow you and the children whole. Afraid that one day you would look at me and see nothing but a monster, just like my father. I'm not worthy of you. I never have been worthy of anything good. But if you're reading this, then I need you to know one thing. Every letter I sounded out, every word I learned, carried your shadow inside it. You taught me how to read. But more than that, you taught me how to see the things I had missed all my life. Thank you for everything. JPS. If I had known how to stay, I would have stayed. Lennox read it again, then a third time, then a fourth. Tears began to slide down her cheeks, falling onto the paper and blurring some of the crooked letters. He hadn't left because he didn't care. He had left because he was fighting the very same fear she had been fighting for 3 years. The fear of not being enough, the fear of hurting the person you loved, the fear of being truly seen and then rejected. She had done the same thing, pushed people away, built walls, lived inside isolation, called it self-protection, when really it had only been another form of running. Jace was doing the same thing, running, hiding behind the excuse of protecting her, when really he was simply afraid. They were alike in a way that hurt. Two lonely people who had found each other, only to push each other away because they were too frightened to stay. Suddenly Micah rose from his chair and ran into the other room. A few seconds later he came back holding his familiar sketchbook. He opened it and laid it on the table in front of Lennox. It was a new drawing. 4 people standing in front of the nest, holding hands. A brown-haired woman, a tall girl, a smaller boy, and a tall man in a black coat. Beneath the drawing, in Micah's crooked handwriting, were the words, "Mr. J, come home." Lennox looked at the drawing, looked at the 2 children now watching her with eyes full of hope. Micah opened his mouth. For the first time in many days, he spoke more than a single word. "Go find Mr. Jace. Bring him home." His voice was soft, but certain. As though this were the simplest truth in the world, Piper nodded. "I agree with Micah. You should go." Lennox looked at the 2 children, looked at the drawing, looked at the handwritten note with its uneven letters. And in that moment, the decision formed. Clear, certain, like sunlight breaking through dark clouds. "I'll go find him," she said, and her voice no longer trembled. "I'll bring him back." Piper smiled, the brightest smile Lennox had seen from her in weeks. Micah nodded and hugged his sketchbook tightly to his chest. Lennox stood up, determination flaring to life in her chest. That afternoon, she took the children to Meredith Shaw's house, the kind 60-year-old neighbor who had helped her more than once. Meredith didn't ask many questions. She only looked at Lennox with understanding in her eyes and nodded. "Go on, sweetheart," she said. "I'll watch the little ones. Don't you worry." Piper hugged Lennox before she left. "Don't forget to bring Mr. Jace back." Micah said nothing. He only handed Lennox the drawing of the 4 of them holding hands, like a little charm meant to guide her. Night fell. Lennox drove her old car through the streets of Boston, the streetlights flickering past the windows like falling stars. She didn't know what she would say when she saw Jace. She didn't know whether he would want to listen. She didn't know whether everything had already come too late. But she knew one thing. She would not let fear make her choices for her again. Sterling Tower rose into view, a 40-story glass tower standing tall against the night, like a lighthouse made of steel and light. Lennox parked at the front entrance, turned off the engine, and looked up toward the top of the tower where she knew Jace would be. She drew in a deep breath, held Micah's drawing in her hand. Then she opened the car door and stepped out. No plan, no guarantees, no idea what would happen next. Only a fierce resolve burning in her chest. She would not let fear win. Not this time. Not ever again. Lennox pushed through the glass doors of Sterling Tower, like a small storm breaking into a winter night. The main lobby of the tower was vast and cold, its polished marble floor reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers. 2 security guards in black suits moved toward her at once, hands raised to stop her. "Sorry, ma'am, the building is closed. You can't go in." Lennox didn't stop. She kept walking straight toward the elevators as though the 2 large men didn't exist at all. "Ma'am." One of the guards hurried after her and stepped in front of her path. "I said you can't. Call Jace Sterling." Lennox cut in, her voice steady, her eyes unblinking. "Tell him Lennox Ashford is here. Right now." The 2 guards glanced at each other, thrown off balance. They weren't used to a small woman in a rain-soaked coat, with tangled hair and red-rimmed eyes burning like fire, walking in and giving orders as though she owned the entire tower. "You don't have the authority. Then I'll find him myself." Lennox stepped to the side, trying to push past them. The guards blocked her. She was shoved back a step. Lennox lifted her head, looked up at the soaring ceiling of the lobby, and shouted with every ounce of strength in her chest. "Jace Sterling, I know you're here. Get down here now." Her voice rang through the lobby and echoed off the marble walls. A few night shift employees leaned out from side offices, curious about the source of the noise. On the 38th floor, in the vast office overlooking all of Boston, Jace Sterling was packing the last of his belongings into a leather suitcase. He had already made his decision. He was leaving Boston, starting over somewhere else, letting Lennox and the children live a normal life without his shadow falling over them. Reed Holloway stepped in, his expression unreadable. "There's a problem," he said. "A woman in the lobby, causing a scene. Security says she's shouting your name." Jace stopped moving. "Who?" "Lennox Ashford." Jace's heart seemed to miss a beat. He moved out of the office fast, not taking time for a coat, not taking time to think. The elevator carried him down to the lobby in 30 seconds that felt like an entire lifetime. The doors opened. Jace saw her. Lennox stood in the center of the lobby, held on either side by 2 guards, yet not looking the least bit afraid. Her coat was drenched with rain, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders, her eyes red from crying but blazing with a fire he had never seen in them before. She looked like a warrior woman who had crossed through hell to get here. "Let her go," Jace said, his voice low but edged with authority no one could challenge. The guards released her at once and stepped back. Lennox walked toward him, each step firm against the marble floor, until she stood right in front of him, only an arm's length away. "Who do you think you are?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, but not from fear. "What gives you the right to decide for me? To decide I'd be better off without you? To decide the children would be safer if you disappeared? Lennox, I was protecting you. You were running away," she cut in, her voice carrying through the silent lobby. "Just like you've been running your whole life. From one city to another, from one relationship to the next, never staying long enough to get hurt." She drew in a deep breath. "Exactly the way I've been living for the last 3 years. Jace couldn't answer. Because she was right. Completely right. And I'm tired, Jace. Lennox's voice softened, but it didn't lose its strength. Tired of building walls. Tired of pushing people away. Tired of being alone. She stepped closer. Even closer. "You think leaving me that building was enough? You think money can replace presence? I don't need that building. I don't need your money. I need a person. I need you." Jace looked at her, looked into those gray-blue eyes burning like twin flames, and the final wall he had spent 33 years building began to crumble, one brick at a time. "I'm afraid," he admitted, his voice rough as though each word had to force its way through an invisible wall in his throat. "Afraid I'll hurt you. Afraid my world will swallow you and the children whole. Afraid that one day you'll look at me and see nothing but a monster." Lennox shook her head. "I've seen you. Really seen you. The man who sat in that little kitchen every night sounding out letters like a child. The man who helped Piper with her algebra. The man Micah drew into the family picture." She took his hand and held it tightly. "I don't see a monster. I see a man who's trying to become better. I don't know how to love," Jace said, almost in a whisper. "I don't know how to stay. I don't know how not to destroy everything I touch." "Then learn," Lennox said, placing her hand against his chest, right over the heart pounding wildly beneath it. "The way you learn to read, one step at a time, one day at a time. We'll learn together." Jace looked down at the small hand resting against his chest. Then he looked back into her eyes, where there was no judgment, no fear, only endless patience and a love he still wasn't sure he deserved. "I don't need you to be perfect," Lennox said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I don't need you to be worthy. I just need you here, with me, with the children, with us." Jace couldn't say anything more. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, as though he feared she would disappear if he let go. Lennox buried her face against his chest, feeling the mad pounding of his heart, and she knew that beneath all that cold armor was a heart aching to be loved every bit as much as her own. "Come home," she whispered against his shoulder. "Come home with us." Jace held her tighter still, and in that moment, standing in the grand lobby of Sterling Tower beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers, 2 people who had once believed they weren't worthy of love found each other at last, and chose not to run anymore. Not this time. Not ever again. The next morning, Boston woke to an earthquake in the financial world. News of Conrad Vance flooded the front pages and filled every morning broadcast. First Atlantic banker, under investigation for suspected money laundering. The FBI receives an anonymous file containing evidence of illegal financial activity. Tycoon Conrad Vance has his assets frozen as a travel ban is issued against him. Jace stood in his office at Sterling Tower, reading the headlines on his phone screen. Reed had done his work well. Every piece of evidence, every illegal transaction from the past 20 years, had been sent to the FBI anonymously, impossible to trace. Vance was now drowning in legal trouble that would take years to escape, if he escaped it at all. But before the police could knock on Vance's door, the man appeared at Sterling Tower himself. Reed stepped into the office, his expression cautious. "Conrad Vance is in the lobby. He's demanding to see you. Says he won't leave until he gets to talk." Jace nodded. "Send him up." 5 minutes later, the office door opened. Conrad Vance stepped inside, looking like a completely different man from the arrogant figure at the gala only weeks before. His suit was wrinkled, as though it hadn't been pressed. His silver hair was disheveled, no longer combed back with perfect care. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. So this is what collapse looks like, Jace thought. This is exactly what it is. Vance stood in the middle of the room without the confidence of a powerful financier. He looked like an animal cornered with nowhere left to run. "Jace," he began, his voice hoarse, "I know you're behind this. The files sent to the FBI, the frozen accounts, all of it." Jace neither denied it nor confirmed it. He only looked at Vance with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. Vance stepped closer, his voice turning pleading. "Pull it back. Withdraw the evidence. I'll leave Boston today. Forever. I'll never come back. I'll never touch her or the children again. We can. No. One word. Final. Cold as a knife blade." Vance froze, his face turning even paler. "Jace, please." He moved forward, almost ready to drop to his knees. "I served Sterling Empire for more than 20 years. Your father and I." "My father is dead," Jace cut in, his voice empty of emotion. "And whatever he built with you means nothing to me now. You'll destroy me over one girl." Vance suddenly roared, desperation turning into anger. "Over a coffee shop owner from the slums. You'll throw away a 20-year relationship over that ridiculous feeling." Jace stepped forward, slowly, each footfall echoing in the silence of the room. He stopped directly in front of Vance, nearly a head taller, his gaze like 2 slabs of ice burning through him. "I'm not destroying you because of her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm letting the law deal with you because of what you did. Money laundering, tax evasion, destroying innocent lives, threatening children." He tilted his head, looking at Vance as though he were staring down at an insect. "She's simply the one who reminded me there's another way. A way that doesn't require becoming a monster to solve everything." Vance trembled, no strength left in him to fight back. "You have 2 choices," Jace continued, his tone as calm as though he were discussing the weather. 1. You turn yourself in to the FBI today. You cooperate fully. Maybe they shave a few years off your sentence. And 2. Run, Jace said with a faint shrug. "But you know I'll find you. And when I do, you'll wish you had chosen the first option." Silence covered the room. Vance stood there with his shoulders sagging and his head lowered. All the arrogance, all the power he had once held, was gone now, dissolving like fog beneath sunlight. "I'll turn myself in," he said at last, his voice no louder than the whisper of a man who had accepted his fate. Jace gave a single nod. "Reed will take you to the station. Make sure you get there safely." Reed appeared at the door as though he had been waiting all along. He led Vance out, leaving Jace alone in the wide office. Jace walked to the window and looked out over Boston, washed in the brightness of morning sunlight. For the first time in his life, he had handled an enemy without violence. For the first time, he had chosen to let the legal system do its work, instead of settling matters with his own hands. For the first time, he had not become the monster. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Jace pulled it out and looked at the screen. A message from Lennox. "The kids want to know when you're coming home." Micah drew another new picture. "You're in this one too. Piper says if you don't come home for dinner, she'll come to Sterling Tower and drag you back herself." Jace smiled. A real smile. Not forced. Not cold. The smile of a man who now had somewhere to return to. People waiting for him. He looked around the vast office where he had lived for 8 years like a lonely king on his own throne. Then he turned his back on it and walked away. The black car pulled out of Sterling Tower and slipped into the flow of Boston traffic. heading toward Dorchester, toward the little coffee shop on the corner, toward Piper's laughter, Micah's silent drawings, and Lennox's gray-blue eyes, toward home. A week had passed since Conrad Vance was arrested, and news of Jace Sterling had spread through Boston like wildfire in a dry season. Sterling Empire kingpin dating a coffee shop owner from the Dorchester slums. That was the headline splashed across the tabloids, paired with blurry photographs of Jace stepping into the nest. The upper crust buzzed with gossip. Social media wouldn't stop sharing the story. And of course, the rumors made their way into the small neighborhood where Lennox lived. The neighbors began to whisper. Curious eyes followed Lennox whenever she stepped out of the shop. Conversations stopped abruptly when she came near. I heard she's involved with the Mafia. Those poor children. What kind of woman lets a crime boss walk in and out of her home? Lennox could endure it. She was used to being judged, used to being talked about, used to building walls and walking forward anyway. The past 3 years had taught her how to do that. But Piper couldn't. One afternoon, the girl came home with red, swollen eyes, her shoulders drawn tight, her school bag clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't say a word. She ran straight into her room and shut the door. Lennox followed, knocking softly. Piper. What happened? Silence. Then the sound of sobbing came through the door. The kids at school said you're dating a criminal. Piper choked out. They said Mr. Jace is a killer. They said you're only doing this for money. Lennox felt as though someone had wrapped a hand around her heart and squeezed. She opened the door, stepped inside, and gathered her little sister into her arms as the girl cried. That evening, Meredith Shaw knocked on the coffee shop door. The 60-year-old woman with silver hair and sharp, knowing eyes did not waste time with polite detours. I have a plan, she told Lennox. Saturday night, I'm hosting a small gathering at my house. I'm inviting you. I'm inviting that Sterling fellow. And I'm inviting the neighbors. It's time people saw the truth instead of swallowing rumors whole. Lennox hesitated, but Meredith did not give her the chance to refuse. On Saturday night, Jace appeared at Meredith's small house. But not as the Jace people usually saw. There was no expensive suit, no long black coat, just a simple white shirt, a pair of jeans, and old leather shoes. He looked like an ordinary man coming to a neighborhood gathering. Inside, about 10 neighbors had already arrived. Pedro the plumber, Elena, who owned the corner grocery, the Martinez family with their 3 small children, a few other familiar faces Lennox passed every day on the street. The air turned tense the moment Jace stepped inside. Everyone knew who he was. The news had told them enough. Wary eyes, stiff smiles, conversations cut short in mid-sentence. Jace stood beside Lennox without saying a word, but his body was drawn taut as wire. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being judged without power in his hands to push back. Meredith rose to her feet and tapped her glass gently to draw the room's attention. I want to say something, she said, her voice carrying strong and clear. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. I've watched every kind of person come and go, and I've learned one thing. She looked around the room, meeting each face in turn. A person isn't defined by a past or a reputation. They're defined by what they choose to do, day by day, one act at a time. Then she turned to Jace. I have seen the way this man looks at that girl, she said, pointing toward Lennox. That is not the look of an evil man. It's the look of someone trying to become better. And at my age, I've seen enough to know the difference. Silence settled over the room. Then Pedro stood up. Last week, somebody paid my wife's hospital bill. Anonymous. He looked at Jace. I can't prove who it was, but I've got a strong feeling. Jace did not confirm it. He did not deny it either. He only gave the smallest nod. Elena spoke next. My grocery store nearly shut down last month because I couldn't cover the rent. Then all at once, the landlord told me the debt had been paid. Also anonymous. One by one, the neighbors began to share what they had noticed. Quiet acts of help over the past few weeks. Bills paid. Repairs done for free. Food left at the doors of struggling families. Jace stood there, not knowing what to say. He had done those things because of Lennox, because he wanted to protect the neighborhood where she lived. He had never expected anyone to notice. At the end of the gathering, Marcus, the hardest man in the neighborhood to please, walked up to Jace. He held out his hand. I don't care what you do outside this place, he said bluntly. Here, you treat Lennox and the children right. For me, that's enough. Jace took his hand. And in that moment, He felt something he had never known in all 33 years of his life. Acceptance. On the walk back to the coffee shop, Lennox and Jace moved beneath the pale yellow streetlights. Piper and Micah ran ahead of them, laughing after an evening that had left them lighter than before. Lennox reached for Jace's hand and squeezed it gently. "Are you okay?" Jace looked at her, looked at the children playing ahead of them, looked at the little neighborhood that had now become his home. "For the first time in my life," he said, his voice soft but certain, his eyes shining beneath the streetlights. "I think I am." 6 months passed, like a beautiful dream. Lennox was no longer afraid to wake from. Spring came to Boston on warm winds, and beneath thousands of cherry blossoms opening across the city. Pale pink petals spun through the air and settled over the sidewalks like a soft carpet, carrying the sweet fragrance of renewal. The nest had changed completely. It was no longer the little broken-down shop that had trembled through a blizzard that winter night. Now it had grown into something larger, with outdoor seating beneath the cherry trees, bright new glass walls, and a line of customers every morning. Not only people from Dorchester, but also business professionals from downtown and students from the nearby universities, all of them making their way to the nest for what many now called the best coffee in Boston. But no matter how crowded the shop became, Lennox still made the coffee herself every morning. That was one thing she never wanted to change. Piper was 13 now, taller, steadier, and at the top of her class all semester long. She told Lennox she wanted to become a doctor, that she wanted to help the sick the way her mother had once needed help. Every afternoon after school, Piper sat in the corner of the shop with her books spread out before her, her eyes bright with dreams of the future. Micah was 9, no longer the quiet little boy curled into himself in the corner of a room. He talked more now, laughed more, and his drawings hung all across the walls of the cafe like a small private art gallery. In every single one, there were 4 people standing hand in hand in front of the coffee shop beneath the blooming cherry trees. Jace still ran Sterling Empire, but everything was changing day by day. He was slowly transforming the empire into something legitimate, cutting away the dark alliances left behind by his father and rebuilding it from the ground up in his own way. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. There were nights he came home late, exhausted and tense. But every morning when he woke and saw Lennox and the children, he knew he was moving in the right direction. He was no longer a man belonging only to the past. He was becoming someone new. Every evening, when the work was done, Jace came back to the coffee shop. Not to Sterling Tower with its cold glass walls, but to the nest, with its warm yellow light and the laughter of children. He sat on the old sofa with a book open in his hands, reading aloud to Piper and Micah. His voice was still slow, and now and then he still stumbled over difficult words. But no one laughed. Piper patiently corrected him. Micah clapped every time he finished a page, and Lennox sat beside them, her gray-blue eyes shining as she watched the man she had once thrown out of her shop 6 months earlier, now reading fairy tales to her children as though he had been born for it. Tonight, after Piper and Micah had drifted off to sleep, Lennox and Jace sat together on the bench outside the shop. Cherry blossoms fell slowly around them, pale petals spinning through the soft spring wind. "Do you ever regret it?" Lennox asked, resting her head against his shoulder. Jace was silent for a moment, looking up at the night sky where the stars shimmered above them. "Every day I wake up and ask myself whether I deserve all of this," he said slowly. "Then I look at you, I look at the children, I look at this coffee shop, and I realize the real question isn't whether I deserve it. It's whether I'm trying, and every day, the answer is yes." Lennox smiled and tightened her hand around his. "I used to think I was meant to be alone," she whispered. "That everyone I loved would always leave. That happiness wasn't meant for people like me." She lifted her head and looked into his dark gray eyes. "Now I understand that happiness isn't a life without storms. It's finding someone willing to stand beside you in the storm." Jace turned and looked at her, the streetlight softening the hard lines of his face. "You taught me that home isn't a place," he said, his voice gentle as spring wind. "Home is a person." They sat there in the warm spring night, watching the cherry blossoms drift down like blessings from the sky. 2 people who had once believed they were unworthy of love. 2 people who had built walls around their hearts because they were afraid of being hurt. Now sitting side by side, their hands clasped together, no longer running. Inside the cafe, Micah's newest drawing hung neatly on the wall. 4 people standing in front of the nest beneath the full bloom of cherry trees. Beneath the drawing, in the boy's crooked handwriting, was one word: family. And that was exactly what they had become: a family. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more moving stories each day. Please like and share this video with the people you love so these good values of love and family can spread a little farther. We would truly love to hear how you felt about this story. What did you think of Lennox and Jace's journey? Which character moved you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We always hope to hear the honest feelings that rise from the deepest places in your heart. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish all of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.